Okay. So we left off, let's go back to the screen share. I think we left off here, verse 24. So we just had 23 was this verse about the rat poison. And now verse 24, continuing on with the same arguments. The mind-only school arguing that mind can see itself. So the mind-only school says, endowed with apt conditions, mind can see. Likewise, it sees itself. So what this means actually is that if mind has the proper conditions, in this case being the practice of calm abiding and special insight, then mind can have clairvoyance. This is something understood in the Buddhist tradition as well as in non-Buddhist traditions in India, that a mind with the proper conditions, so the same way that the eye, the physical eye, empowers mind to be able to have visual consciousness, then through the cultivation of meditative stabilization, then it's possible to have direct mental perception, which is not something we usually have. The mind gains an uncommon ability to see things directly. So the point is that the mental consciousness has an ability to have direct perception. So why can't it thereby also see itself? So the response is, a magic salve helps you to see a pot, but not the salve itself. So he's saying that they're making a category error here by saying that if the apt conditions allow the mind to see, therefore the mind can see itself. He's saying that if the salve you apply to your eyes allows you to have better vision, doesn't mean that you actually see the salve. Now it's not clear exactly how that answers the question, because the objection is that the apt conditions allow you to see external objects at a distance. So he's not arguing that you can see those conditions. He's saying that you can see the mind itself. However, the point might be the same, that if something you apply to your eyes enhances your eye power, it doesn't mean that you can see your own eyes. It just means that your eyes are clearer to see things far away, or to have a clearer vision. But also in the commentary, it mentions that not only does this point not prove that mind sees itself, it also doesn't prove that mind and the external object are one entity, which is also the Chitta-matra position, the mind-only position. So in the same way that the salve is not the same as the eyes, these are all three different things. It's actually it's saying that it actually undermines their own position, because it's showing that different conditions that are different for mind are necessary for mind to function. So it doesn't make sense to say that everything is one nature with mind. Then it continues. Again, this is a implicit debate that the mind-only school is making here. They say without self-cognizers, there is no memory. This is we talked about this before. So they believe that if there is no experience of the mind at the time of the experience of the external object, then we wouldn't remember having consciousness. And therefore, there is no way to remember anything, because we can no longer verify anything. We no longer know that we saw anything. So experience of objects, sight, and hearing all disappear. This comes back again to the point of, if things don't exist conventionally, then there is no, if things don't exist ultimately, then they can't function conventionally. So the response is, to see and hear and know are not negated in this paradigm. This paradigm being the conventional. In the conventional existence, we're not negating that people see and hear and know things. But here the cause of suffering, conceiving true existence, is. So what we're negating is that things exist truly, not that they exist at all. And furthermore, there's two kinds of negation in Madhyamaka philosophy. There is negation of the object, but there's also negation of the subject. So negation of the object is to negate that there's true existence, but that also negates the subject, the mind conceiving true existence. In that context, negation doesn't mean showing it doesn't exist, it means that the mind starts to diminish. That if we have a strong conception of true existence, then that will gradually be negated and disappear, because we will no longer believe that things truly exist. So that's what we're trying to really get rid of through meditation, is the cause of suffering, which is conceiving that things exist in a solid, fixed way that doesn't depend on other conditions. Then 26 and part of 27 has, again, the mind-only school responds, illusions don't exist apart from mind, yet they're impermanent. So again, in the mind-only school, for them, impermanence is a sign that things function. The middle way agrees with that functioning things and impermanent things are synonymous. So the mind-only school is trying to argue, well, in our system, where we say that mind is truly existent and external objects do not exist, yet nevertheless there can be a functioning thing, a physical thing that functions, even though it doesn't exist apart from the mind. Likewise, like an illusion. If I see this mirage in the distance, although it doesn't exist outside of my mind perceiving it, yet it still functions. It still causes me to become thirsty. It still is changing moment to moment, so it's impermanent. But then the response is, how can what's real be non-distinct? So you are saying, according to the mind-only school, that nevertheless, physical things, although they don't exist apart from mind, they're still real. They still function. But if the Madhyamaka, the middle way school, is saying that if something is real, it has to exist how it appears. This is a criterion for things being real, is that the way they exist is the way they actually appear. Otherwise, when we say something is unreal, we mean that for example, the illusion, the horse does not exist. The horse does not appear the way it exists, the way it appears. The illusion, if you want to say it's real, well, if you see it, it's an illusion. It's an illusion. It's different. We say seeing a mirage and seeing water are two different things, right? So although for somebody who's deluded, the mirage appears as water. For somebody who knows that it's a mirage, then there's no false appearance at all. They're just seeing there's a mirage in the distance. They don't say there's water in the distance. So if something is real, then it can't be non-distinct from mind, because it appears to not be. The external objects appear to be external. So if they're real, they should exist the way they appear, which is they should exist externally. So the mind only comes back to saying it's non-distinct. And then the Madhyamaka says it's not, then it's not real. So it doesn't seem to be moving forward with the argument here, that it say, how can that be, with real be non-distinct? It's non-distinct, then it's not real. But then they advance the argument again. Just as illusions are untrue, yet seen, likewise the mind that sees. So you're arguing that something can be untrue and still be seen. You're saying that the illusion is untrue, yet it could still function. Well, in that case, why can't the mind also be untrue but still function? The argument for mind being real and function and true is that we can perceive its functioning. But you're also saying here that although physical objects don't exist externally, they still exist as functioning things, and they just don't exist the way they appear. Well, thereby we can say the same for the mind, that it appears to be a real thing when we experience it, and it functions, but it doesn't actually exist the way it appears. So the mind only then comes back with another point, which is another reason that they consider that things exist truly, is because they have to have a real base. It has to come down to something in the end. So although there is no external world, the appearance of it has to be based on a real thing. Otherwise, there's nothing at all. It has to eventually meet back to some real thing that is generating the illusion. They say samsara needs a base that's real, or else it's baseless, like the sky. Otherwise, there's nothing at all. There's no base for anything. So then, in the middle way school, that doesn't have to be the case. Unreal things are based on other unreal things. Nothing is real. There's nothing you can find that is the ultimate base for everything else. The response is, if non-real things were based on real, How'd they have functionality? So because in the middle way school, if something functions, it cannot be real. If something is real, that implies that it is static and unchanging, because when you search for it, you can really find it. Things that function only exist in conjunction with other things, and therefore they can function. And therefore they're not real, they're dependent on others. So then he's arguing back to the Chittamacha, the mind only, who's saying that mind exists as a real thing and the physical world is not real. But your mind's left companionless, becoming just a lonely thing. So your mind, what you call mind, exists when nothing else exists. So then in your system, there's nothing that is experiencing. So how does it even make sense to talk about it as mind? How can it be that the experiencer exists, but what experience doesn't exist? It only exists in relation to what it's experiencing. But in your system, your mind is left as a companionless thing, a lonely thing. It seems also there's a bit of a, we say sometimes the argument becomes a bit personal. It's sort of insulting them that you're left just a lonely thing. So since mind's without an object, then to thusness we've already gone. So this is saying to thusness we've already gone. It's saying Dejin Jek, which in Tibetan is the word for a Buddha, Tathagata. Tathagata means the one gone to thusness. So it's saying if mind is without an object, according to you, there's a mind, there's no object, then there's no object, there's nothing that's conceived as truly existent or inherently existent, because there's no objects of mind. So we've all already become Buddhas, because nobody conceived true existence. And thus what benefit remains to study the mind-only view. So if we're all already Buddhas, then why do we need the mind-only system? Because the point of the mind-only system is to free us from delusion, that we can become enlightened. But in your system, it follows that we're all already enlightened, because all that exists is mind, and there's nothing else to grasp at. So the mind-only would say, just knowing an illusion, how are one's afflictions overcome? So they're arguing back to the middle way school. Okay, so you said that our meditation on mind only doesn't overcome afflictions, but you think that meditating on everything as illusory overcomes afflictions. But in your system, the man who conjures phantom girls, alas, is still attached to them. So they're saying that if your example for the way that things the way that we're free of delusion is to meditate on everything as illusory, that doesn't help, because you're still attached to things. Somebody can conjure illusions and still be attached to them because they appear to be pretty. I don't know if that happens, but it's likely it could. People, for example, somebody makes a movie and they know it's a movie. Actually, all of us know when we watch movies that it's just a movie, but if we find the characters attractive, we feel attraction towards them. So just knowing it's an illusion doesn't necessarily stop us from being attracted. And actually, I remember hearing people say, sometimes they fall in love with the character in the movie, and for weeks they're thinking about that character, even though they know perfectly well that's not a real person. So they're making a point here that just because you can meditate on an illusion doesn't overcome your attachment. The response is that conjurer is not rid himself of imprint of affliction towards those objects. When he sees them, then his imprint of shunyata is weak, the shunyata being emptiness. So yes, it's true that a magician or a conjurer can be attached to his own, what he conjures, but that's because he hasn't really fully comprehended the truth of emptiness. It's not a very strong imprint. So it's not enough just to meditate on a few things, to meditate on, okay, this movie I saw, it's not a real thing. But nevertheless, if I'm still attached to objects, then my mind will still create attachment to whatever appears, whether it's a movie or not. But if somebody really meditates deeply on emptiness, then that will actually stop happening. This is the argument that he's making here. So through cultivating imprints of shunyata, imprints of real things subside. That too will cease to be by cultivating nothing at all. So he's saying that if we actually meditate deeply on emptiness, then gradually the attachment to real things will subside, even though it doesn't happen immediately. Just saying it's an illusion doesn't necessarily overcome our attachment, but if we meditate for a long time, gradually it actually will be overcome. And that too will cease, is saying that even the realization of emptiness, we could become attached to that and think that is real. So by that will cease by cultivating nothing at all. This means that we just meditate on emptiness of everything. So we don't just meditate on the emptiness of the external world, we also meditate on the emptiness of the mind itself, and don't become attached to our own realizations, because we recognize those also as empty. Then when nothing's there, nothing's observed, to be the mind that's scrutinized. So when there's no external object, then how can there be a mind that's perceiving it also when we analyze that mind? So then how, without a base, can an unreal thing stay before the mind? So if there's no real things, then there's no unreal things either, in the sense that there's no truly existent or inherently existent unreal things, just as there's no inherently existent real things. So we shouldn't get attached to either of them. So neither of them will stay before the mind, in the sense that when we analyze, both of them will disappear, and then we'll be left with emptiness. So when neither real nor unreal things abide before the mind, because no other aspects there within non-observation be at peace. So he's saying, once this is describing the realization of emptiness. Once you see that there is no truly existent real thing or truly existent unreal thing, then you'll be left with no more objects appearing for the mind. And within the non-observation of anything truly existent, be at peace. So be in peace in this context is talking about cessation of suffering. So this, as I said, this is the verse where it said that Shantideva, he then ascended into the air and disappeared. So this is the end of this part of the text, of the analysis of emptiness. So it's left with this final verse on emptiness. Then it comes back to, from that space of emptiness, this is what His Holiness has actually talked about quite a bit in the past few days, about from the space of emptiness, then still manifesting in the world to benefit others. This is how the text continues. So somebody argues, if the Buddha has pacified all conceptions, he doesn't have the thought, I will teach the Dharma to trainees. So it is incorrect that he would teach at all. Why would a Buddha teach if he has no thoughts anymore, and everything is just perceived as unreal? So the response is, like wish-fulfilling jewels in trees, completely satisfy our hopes. To trainees, by the force of prayers, the victor's holy form appears. So this is an interesting point, because one way to interpret this, which is the interpretation of a lot of previous Tibetans, because when you say the force of prayers, it's actually talking about the Buddha's prayers. It's saying that as a Bodhisattva, the Buddha made prayers that when I'm a Buddha, may I benefit all beings. So therefore, even though the Buddha's mind is no longer present, by the force of the previous prayers, he appears to beings. So some Tibetan scholars believe that the Buddha does not actually have a mind. It seems to be the position of also many Indians, such as Vimukti, one of the previous commentators on the ornament of clear realization before Haribhadra. Haribhadra is the commentator that Tsongkhapa follows, whereas a lot of the other Tibetan schools, they rely on Vimukti commentary, which would at least appear on the surface to be saying that the Buddha does not exist, that the Buddha's, from his own side, there is no experience. There's nobody experiencing anything, because it's gone beyond any kind of experience. However, by the force of prayers, it appears to beings. That the karma of the beings causes the force of the merit that the Buddha accumulated to then have the appearance of the Buddha teaching. And Tsongkhapa, it seems, even in some of his early works, he describes this position. So some people would say he actually was interested in this position and later negated it, but saying that the Buddha, what appears to us is just a reflection from our own karma, and a dependent arising between that and the merit of the Buddha. But the Buddha himself does not have any experience. There's nobody there. It's not a nihilistic view in the sense, at least according to this school, that it's not saying that there's nothing at all. It's just saying that when we talk about mind, that only exists in the conventional world, and the Buddha is no longer experiencing the conventional world. But like wish-fulfilling jewels and trees, which are things that are blessed by a powerful being and then continue to satisfy our hopes, the power of the Buddha's prayers, then still it appears to us. So, of course, in the Gelug school, that's not the accepted position. So they would interpret this slightly differently, to be saying that that the Buddha, it does not have conceptual consciousness, but there is still a non-conceptual mind there that is responding to us through the power of prayers, that still to the force of the merit of the Buddha, and without even having to make any thought about things, it just happens spontaneously. But that doesn't mean that the Buddha has no mind at all. It just means that there's no thought, I will do this, I will do that. It just happens spontaneously. It's a very different kind of experience. So then he gives an example. For instance, Brahmin priests construct Garuda shrines, then pass away. So I'm not exactly sure what a Garuda shrine is, but it seems that there is an idea that they could build this kind of shrine that would perform actions of healing for the people around them and the local people. So the Brahmin priests, they construct the Garuda shrine and then they die. The priest dies. Although now many years have passed, the shrine just uses poison and such. So even though it's been many years since the Brahmin died, still what he built is still benefiting beings. So likewise, even though the Buddha has passed into nirvana, still the force of his merit still benefits beings. Like that, the victor's shrine that's formed in line with Bodhisattva deeds, although the Bodhisattva's passed from sorrow, still fulfills our needs. So this is the example says, the Buddha has passed beyond sorrow. However, based on the Bodhisattva deeds and the prayers that he made while he was a Bodhisattva, then his form still appears to us as an illusion in accordance with our karma. So then the Sarvaka, the hearer, the non-Mahayana system, they are arguing back because so before, if you remember, we had an earlier opponent who was not named, and then later was the mind-only arguing, and now the hearer is arguing. So it's a different opponent. There will be several more opponents that come up to the text. So they're arguing against the Mahayana position that a Buddha has gone beyond sorrow, because in the Sarvaka system, when the Buddha passes into nirvana, then there is no longer any Buddha. There's no longer anybody to help us. We have to be left, all we have left is the teachings, the Dharma that the Buddha left behind, and the Sangha, the people practicing it. But the Buddha has passed beyond. There's no longer any benefit in praying to the Buddha. There's no longer any way that the Buddha can benefit us. So they argue, how do offerings made before a mindless thing bring any result? So then the response is, because it's said to be the same if he abides or is passed beyond. So in this system, whether the Buddha is passed into nirvana or whether he's still living, in either case, his mind is the same. There is no birth and death from the point of view of the Buddha. So a pure argument is that when he passes into nirvana, there's no longer any mind. It should be the same. When the Buddha is alive, he can't benefit us because there is no mind. So again, the Gelug interpretation of this is going to be that there's no mind, no conceptual mind. But in either case, the Buddha's mind is not differentiated between birth and death. It's experiencing the same. The birth and death of the Buddha only appears to us based on our karma, not on the Buddha's own experience. Conventionally or in real fact, in either case, the scriptures say results are there, like how results are there when Buddhas truly exist. So whether it's a real Buddha or a fake Buddha, an illusory Buddha, it still performs functions. It has nothing to do with the Buddha in specific. The question is whether an illusory thing can perform a function. The scriptures say that the Buddhas that they teach and they help us and they benefit us. So that shouldn't be the argument. It's not about the Buddha per se. It's whether an illusory thing can perform a function. So then there's a number of verses here about defending the Mahayana system. So the Sarvakas are arguing that there's no need for the Mahayana teachings, or they'll also argue that they aren't the teachings of the Buddha. They're arguing that you don't need to meditate on emptiness in order to be liberated. So These are actually very important verses. We study these quite in depth when we study Madhyamaka in the monastery, because this is considered to be one example. So that I said that according to Tsongkhapa, there are only a few Indian scholars who he considers to be prasangika, or of the system of the consequentialist, who correctly interpreted Nagarjuna's teachings. And according to this interpretation, in order to be liberated, someone has to realize emptiness. It doesn't matter if one wants to be a Buddha or a hero or arhat. In either case, one has to realize emptiness. Whereas some other Madhyamakas, and also the mind-only schools, some other Madhyamakas like Bhavaviveka and Shantarakshita, and all of the mind-only school, they believe that to be liberated from samsara does not require realizing emptiness. This requires realizing the selflessness of person. And that to be a full Buddha, one has to realize emptiness. But it becomes clear from these verses that in Shantideva's system, regardless of anything, one has to realize emptiness. So there could be Shervaka philosophers who believe that one does not have to realize emptiness. And that is the case. They reject emptiness and say that it's not necessary and it wasn't taught by the Buddha. So they say to see the truth will liberate, what's gained from seeing emptiness. So in this context, the truth means the Four Noble Truths. By meditating on the Four Noble Truths, one can be liberated. So why does one need to see emptiness? So Shantideva's response is, because from scripture, there is no enlightenment without this path. So this is a quotation from the 25,000 verse Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. Hold on one sec. It's in the book here. But basically it says in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra that for those who hold the true existence, there is no liberation. Yeah, from the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, it says, Mopo Dushi Janatarpame. Yeah, that's right. So for those who discriminate true existence, then there is no liberation. So it's quoting scripture. So of course, the Sarvaka is going to come back and say that's not taught by the Buddha, because he's quoting a Mahayana sutra. So that's what the next verses will be about, is defending the Mahayana teachings. But in the point here being that according to Shantideva's system, in order to be liberated from samsara, one has to realize emptiness. And this also becomes important because it's saying it's not enough just to realize the Four Noble Truths. So does that mean that to realize the Four Noble Truths, one does not have to realize emptiness? And actually, that's not the case. In Shantideva's system, even realizing the Four Noble Truths means realizing emptiness. So it's understood here that when they say to see the truth, they're not actually seeing the truth. They're seeing a coarse understanding of the Four Noble Truths. They don't actually understand them properly. So that is implicit in this verse. That is not made explicit here. So the Sravaka says the Mahayana is not verified. It's not; these aren't authentic scriptures. So the Shantideva says your scriptures verified by what? How do you know your scriptures are verified? Because it's verified by both. So he's saying that, well, because we both accept it as the teaching of the Buddha. And he says, well, that too at first for you was not. When you first encountered the teachings of the Buddha, you didn't accept them. And then you learned them and then you later accepted them. So that has nothing to do with whether they're verified or not, whether you accept them or I accept them. It should have to do with examining their veracity. That's how you came to accept your own scriptures. So therefore you should examine the Mahayana based on whether it's true or not based on whether certain people accept it. So what drives you to believe in this? Meaning, why do you believe in your own scriptures? For Mahayana, it's the same. So if your reasoning is because it's true and it makes sense, then it should be the same for Mahayana. Or if it were true since two believe, so if your reasoning is that it's true because two people believe in it, then the Vedas also would be true. So many people believe in the Vedas, but you don't accept them. Why not? If at least two people, many people don't believe in them. So this argument, basically the point is, we can't just base our arguments on tradition or what a person said. It has to be based on reasoning. If we just accepted arguments based on what is authoritative in tradition, then why do we accept our tradition and not accept other traditions where they say the Vedas are true? The Sarvaka comes back, the Mahayana is under dispute. So it seems to be the same argument again, that, well, the Mahayana is a cause for dispute, whereas we all accept the Hinayana teachings. So your scriptures by non-Buddhists and others by both are fought about. So your scriptures, your Pali Canon, for example, non-Buddhists dispute with it, so it's also under dispute. It's not that the scriptures are accepted by everyone, and other scriptures are fought about by both. There are Buddhist scriptures that are not considered authoritative by both non-Buddhist and Buddhists. So any scripture is going to have somebody arguing with it. That if that's a reason, throw them away. So if you think that the fact that something is argued about proves that it's therefore not valid, then throw your own scriptures away because people argue about them. If bhikshus are the teaching's root, then their being bhikshus is unsound. So this has different actually interpretations, this verse. It's not totally clear, but Gyaltsabje's interpretation based on Tsongkhapa is that what this means here, bhikshus in this context actually, because bhikshu generally means a Buddhist monk, but also the term bhikshu can refer to an arhat, because that's considered an ultimate bhikshu. The real bhikshu is the arhat. So the arhats in this context being the teaching's root means that the great arhat disciples of the Buddha, such as Mahakasyapa and Ananda and Upali, who were the main disciples who codified the Buddhist canon, the first Buddhist council, they are the root of the Buddhist teachings, because everything that comes in the teachings comes from their having put together the canon of the Buddhist teachings. So in your system, these people did not realize emptiness, because you consider that in order to be an arhat, one doesn't have to realize emptiness. So their being bhikshus is unsound, is saying that actually they can't be bhikshus, they can't be arhats because they didn't realize emptiness. Why not? And then it comes, if objects stay in mind, the path beyond all sorrow is unsound. So as long as one still is grasping at true existence, which according to you they were, then it's impossible that they could have achieved nirvana, because one cannot be free of all suffering if one still considers things to be real, even if one meditates on the selflessness of persons. If they were freed, abandoning afflictions, it would be just then. But again, this is very hard to understand just from the wording. But the point here is that you're saying, in your system, you Shervakas are saying that by meditating on the Four Noble Truths, we see that people are free, their afflictions diminish. So that should be enough. But Shantideva, his point here is coming back to, you didn't really understand the Four Noble Truths. So when you meditate on the Four Noble Truths, what you're experiencing is not actually liberation. You're only experiencing a temporary liberation based on meditative stabilization. So what that means is that in Shantideva's, and in the middle way system, Madhyamaka system, somebody can think they're liberated. It's similar to when non-Buddhists, they achieve calm abiding, and they achieve meditative concentrations, and they think that they're free of afflictions. So in that context, once they achieve the meditative stabilization, as soon as they achieve it, they are no longer experiencing manifest afflictions. So it would be just then is saying that as soon as they achieve the meditative stabilization, there should be no further work to do, because there is nothing else to do. If you aren't going to abandon the seeds of the afflictions, which you can't if you don't realize emptiness, then it's enough just to have the meditative stabilization. So as soon as you have that meditative stabilization, you no longer have to do any work. So you should have been liberated as soon as you had that meditative stabilization. You don't longer have to meditate on the path of meditation and all these countless aeons of meditation, because as soon as you have calm abiding special insight and you experience the coarse understanding of the Four Noble Truths, you're not going to have coarse afflictions. And you can't abandon subtle afflictions with your view. So that's all you're going to be able to have. So with no affliction, still they're seen to be controlled by karma's force. So he's saying that he's actually basing this on a sutra quotation. In this case, it's from the sutra. It's called Santen Peikyu Gido in Tibetan, which means so Peikyu means like to conceal something. So like if I have something very profound, I don't tell anybody. I conceal it myself. And something is meditation. So it seems to be implying that there was some secret that the Buddha didn't teach in public that he had taught to more advanced disciples. This is the name of the sutra. And in that sutra, the Buddha says that some people, they practice my teachings and they achieve some coarse understanding of them. And they meditate for a long time and they think they're liberated. But they're not liberated because they haven't actually realized emptiness. So according to them, because they no longer experience manifest afflictions, they are liberated. But when they die, they realize they're not, because they realize that they have to be reborn. So this is referencing that sutra to show that there can be people who they think they've meditated on the Buddha's teachings for a long time. They think they're liberated, but actually they're controlled by karma's force. And when they die, they're then reborn again. So the Sarvakas say, it's certain since the craving that conditions the main cause is gone. So they're saying that, well, okay, if you can't, maybe you can't abandon ignorance by meditating on emptiness, without meditating on emptiness. Let's grant that, even though we don't accept it, but we'll say, okay, you said that. But nevertheless, you can abandon craving. By meditating on the Four Noble Truths, if we understand them, we can be free of all craving. And craving is the cooperative condition that controls rebirth. So it's a eighth link of dependent origination. So even if one still has ignorance, if no longer has craving, one won't be reborn. The response is, this craving is not afflictive, so why, like afflictions, is it gone? So what he's saying here is that if you say that, okay, there's two different kinds of ignorance. There's ignorance grasping at a core self of persons, and there is ignorance grasping at true existence. But that the craving is only based on the grasping at the core self of persons. So realizing the core self of persons will abandon craving. Well, why can't craving also have two levels? So why, like affliction, is it gone? Is saying there could be a kind of craving. This craving he's talking about here, that is based on a subtle kind of craving based on conceiving true existence. So why, like manifest affliction, should it be gone? It is not, he's saying. This is exactly the same as what Chandakirti talks about in the entering the middle way. This is again why Tsongkhapa equates the two of them in their view, where he says that people, so your yogic mind perceiving selflessness is not to perceive the truth of things. So your understanding of yogic direct perception is too coarse. You don't see the underlying emptiness of them. So when you encounter objects such as forms, external forms, because you conceive them to be truly existent, then still affliction will arise, even if it's very subtle. And that, if there's even a very subtle level of affliction, then that is like a spark that will eventually ignite coarse afflictions again. So it doesn't, even if meditating on the Four Noble Truths in a coarse way seems to diminish your craving, there's still some very subtle kind of craving that's based on grasping at true existence. And that will cause the manifest craving to come again when conditions are right. They still have feeling, and by that, as a condition, craving comes. So this is saying that those people who meditate only on the Course Four Noble Truths, they still have feeling, right? The seventh link of dependent origination. And feeling is the seventh link, creates the eighth link, craving. So as long as still one has feeling and still considers that feeling is truly existent, then eventually they'll be craving again. A mind observing objects still remains at large for some of them. So a mind observing objects means the mind perceiving true existence. So it remains at large. That's an English phrase, but it means it still hasn't been arrested. It still hasn't been put away totally. So it's still functioning, and that will thereby cause interact with feeling and bring more craving, because one believes that the feeling is truly existent. The pain and the suffering and the pleasant feelings are truly existent. That will cause more craving. So when mind is devoid of emptiness, what ceased will still arise again, like non-perceptive equipoise. So the whole point of all of these verses is that one cannot be liberated without perceiving emptiness. So when one mind is devoid of emptiness, when mind doesn't meditate on emptiness, then what ceased will still arise again. So what ceased, meaning that you think your craving is gone, but it will still come again if you haven't realized emptiness. Like non-perceptive equipoise, this is a practice of non-Buddhists. They practice non-perceptive equipoise and then feel that they're liberated from samsara. Like the Buddha trained in this before he became the Buddha. And his teachers thought that they were liberated, but he's saying that that's not liberation. So it's a similar problem. You haven't gotten to the root of it, so you haven't, it will still arise again as soon as that meditative stabilization declines. So meditate on emptiness. So then we have a few verses, again, arguing about the Mahayana Sutras. Some speeches in the sutra class that Buddha spoke it, you agree. But there are sutra teachings that you agree were taught by the Buddha. Don't also you agree that most of Mahayanas like your texts? So why don't you say the same thing about Mahayana? If you said that about these sutras. So he's then quoting a few a few sutras here. Oh, here it is. So he's talking about the sutra class. Actually, we should understand this. So we have sutra in the general sense, right? The sutra, the teachings of the Buddha. But also when we divide the teachings of the Buddha, we have the three classes of the teachings, the three baskets. So there are the Vinaya teachings, the sutra teachings, and the Abhidharma teachings. So the Vinaya teachings, of course, the teachings of monastic discipline. There are also sutras. The Vinayas are sutras. The Vinaya teachings are sutras, but they're not the sutra class. Sometimes these things get confusing in Buddhist philosophy. There's all these different terms used for the same thing. So the sutra class means the teachings on meditative stabilization. And then the Abhidharma class of teachings are the sutras that talk about wisdom. So there are teachings in the sutra class that you agree upon. But then the Abhidharma teachings, which many of the Mahayana sutras, especially the Perfection of Wisdom sutras, are in the Abhidharma class. So likewise, many of the Mahayana teachings also teach the three trainings, the training in ethical discipline and concentration and wisdom, like the three classes of teachings. So these three classes of teachings also exist in the Mahayana, just as they exist in the Hinayana teachings. So don't you agree that they're like your text? They teach the same kinds of things. If all of them are faulty, since one fails to meet your standards, then should not they all be victor speech, since one is like the sutras too? So his point is that if you reject everything in the Mahayana sutras, because one of them doesn't make sense to you, well, some of them make sense. Some of the things said in the Mahayana Sutras are exactly the same teachings that are in the Hinayana Sutras, especially a lot of the teachings on meditative stabilization. So if the whole class of Mahayana teachings is false because one part of it doesn't make sense to you, then the whole thing should be true because some part of it does make sense to you. That's not enough just to say it's all false because some of it doesn't make sense. So then he's going to go on to say about that part that doesn't make sense to you, just because it doesn't make sense to you isn't a reason to reject it. So he says, well, first the Sravaka says, if the perfection of wisdom sutras are Buddha's speech, Mahakasyapa and others should realize its meaning, but they don't. So we see this happening in the Mahayana Sutras, like in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. We see that some of the great disciples of the Buddha, like Mahakasyapa, couldn't understand what he was saying. Only some very select disciples could. So then he comes back using this argument against them. The speech the great Kasyapa and the others failed to comprehend, why should your not cognizing it be cause to say it's meaningless? So you've just admitted that the great Kasyapa, who is one of the greatest disciples, couldn't understand it. And the Buddha acknowledged that he couldn't understand it. So why should you, who say that I don't understand it, why should that be a reason to say that it's meaningless? If such a great person like Kasyapa couldn't understand it, just because you can't understand it doesn't mean it's meaningless. It just means that maybe it's too profound for you. So at the end, now we finished the verses about the Mahayana text. So now he goes on to speak actually about the benefits of emptiness. So rather than trying to argue against somebody else who's saying that emptiness should be meditated on, now he's saying, what are the benefits of meditating on emptiness? So freed from extremes of craving and fear, for those who suffer, confused, who suffer still within samsara, they remain. So it's saying bodhisattvas or Buddhas are freed from the extremes of craving, which means attachment to samsara, and fear, in this case, would be that they remain in solitary nirvana because they are afraid to enter back into samsara again. And for those who are confused, who suffer still, so there's still beings left in samsara, they remain. So the Buddhas remain in samsara, even though they're liberated. So that is the fruit of emptiness. That is what happens from meditating on emptiness. And so it's wrong to controvert the point of view of emptiness. And so should you, without a doubt, now meditate on emptiness. So we can see the benefit of emptiness. So it's wrong to try to negate it. It's worthwhile to meditate on it because it has a good result. The knowledge and afflictions veils, gloom's emptiness, antidote is emptiness. So this, sorry for the double apostrophe here, but I'm trying to, it's a bit hard to fit these very complex words into the meter. But we can see this, that the knowledge and afflictions veil. The veil means the obscurations. So the afflictive obscurations, which prevent liberation from samsara, and the knowledge obscurations, which prevent full Buddhahood. The gloom of the veils of the afflictions. So the gloom here is like the confusion. So they're just using a poetic way to describe what are the obscurations. There's this confusion in the mind of the obscurations, and the antidote to that is emptiness. You wish to swiftly cognize all. Why don't you meditate on it? So if this emptiness is the antidote to all of the obscurations, and you wish to quickly be a Buddha and cognize all, then why don't you meditate on emptiness? A thing that causes suffering is something that it's right to fear, but emptiness quells suffering. So why are you afraid of it? So there might be people who are afraid of emptiness. It seems like a nihilistic view. But he's saying that actually, although it might seem fearful that everything is lacking inherent existence, actually meditating on it diminishes suffering. So why be afraid of it? If any self existed, then there'd be a cause to be afraid. Since there exists no self at all, then what are you afraid about? So if it was the case that we were negating something that existed, then yes, it would be fearful to negate it. But there is no self at all. We're only pointing out what already is true. It's just, so there's nothing to be afraid of. We're just pointing out how things are. So it could be like an example, if you're afraid of something in the dark, if I shine a light on it, it should make you less afraid because I show it's not there. I'm just showing you that what you're afraid of isn't there at all. There's no cause to be afraid. There's nothing that's actually threatening you. That has to, then the first step has to be to actually look there and see. You don't want to be afraid to look in the dark and see what's there. So then we come on to the self-insist of persons. He has several verses analyzing that the person is not found anywhere in the body. So, and also within the mind. So it is meditation on self-insist of person. Just deconstructing that all these different aspects of the self, all these different aggregates that on which the self is designated, are not themselves the self. The teeth and nails are not the self. The self is not the bones or blood, nor mucus, nor the phlegm, and not the pus, and not the lymph as well. So that's pretty easy to understand the words anyway, but of course these verses are intended for meditation. So it's something that we can go through one by one and analyze. Does that constitute a self? The self's not grease, nor is it sweat. The lungs and liver aren't the self. The inner cavities aren't self. The self's not urine or excrement. So just again, one by one, going through the parts of the body. The flesh and skin are not the self. Not heat, nor wind, nor orifice is self. The sixfold consciousness is not in any way a self. So we've gone through one by one the parts of the body, and then also the empty parts of the body, the orifices, where there's just a lack of something. But then we come to the consciousness. That's the deeper question, because I think, it's more likely somebody would attach to their consciousness as their self. Although certainly we have let's say, innate grasping at the body also as self. But if someone were to analyze it and be asked, they would probably be more likely to consider that the consciousness is the self. So then we'd go through the consciousness one by one. Well, if we say consciousness is self, which consciousness? Right? Because we have eye consciousness and ear consciousness. Are they the same thing? Certainly in Buddhist philosophy, they're not. So it's not as though there was actually one school of thought in Buddhism that there is a single consciousness. So it's like a monkey in a house looking through different windows. And that consciousness is just sitting in your head and looking through your eyes, and it sees, and it looks through your ears, and it hears. But the problem with that is that the mental consciousness is usually conceptual, and the sense consciousness is direct perception. So those are two different kinds of things: sense perception, or the direct perception, and conceptual mind. So it's experienced in very different way. The mind, the conceptual consciousness, is not like a person looking through a telescope that looks through the eyes. They're two different conscious experiences. One is non-conceptual and one is conceptual. So then somebody might argue, well, then the conceptual consciousness is really the person. This is actually what, for example, Bhava Viveka argues, one of the other Indian philosophers. So then we have to analyze, is that the case? Is the conceptual consciousness or is the mental consciousness the person? So there might be reason to think so. There might be reason to say, well, actually, what it's the person, it's what makes decisions is the mental consciousness. It's what's held accountable for things. My body is not held accountable if my mind is not there. And it's what migrates from life to life. The mental consciousness does not die. Although the coarse levels of it die, it migrates from life to life. So is the mental consciousness a person? So one problem with that is that if that was the case, when I say me, I should be referring to my mental consciousness, right? So if we say, well, what is really me? That's implying that first of all, I have this idea of me, and then I'm going to search for it. So if I say me, I also talk about my body. I point to my body and say that's me. So it implies that my concept of me is not simply a concept of a mental consciousness. It's a concept of something that is based on more than just that. So then one could argue, well, that concept of me is how it appears to me at a course level, but really who I am is the mental consciousness. But the problem with that is then it's losing the original point of what I was trying to search for. I was trying to say, what is this thing that I experience as me? Well, if there's something else that's me, that's different than what I experience as me, how does that help me at all in terms of trying to figure out what is it I'm talking about when I say me? So then there's no longer any reason to posit the mental consciousness as a person, because we're just trying to find what the person is in terms of this person that I talk about as me. Who is that? So it's definitely not the mental consciousness, because I don't talk about it that way. There's no use in saying it's something completely different from how I experience it, because then it's divorced from what I'm trying to search for. It's like saying, what is it really that is a chariot? And I say, well, it's the horse. Well, that doesn't make any sense, because the chariot is totally separate from the horse. It doesn't work to prove that the horse is the chariot, because it doesn't accord at all with what I'm talking about when I talk about a chariot. So that's just a bit of a tangential point here. But definitely, as I say, when we meditate on these things, the most likely thing we're going to get stuck on is the mind, that the mind is the person. So that is something that it will require further analysis. It doesn't actually describe it a lot here. That's why I wanted to just mention a bit of it. But if certainly in Chandrakirti's text, if you're actually interested in that and entering the middle way, he talks quite a bit more about that. About the mind, that the mind cannot be the person or the collection of the things. So Shantideva here, he's giving a fairly brief presentation of it. But as I mentioned yesterday, toward the end of the talk, based on what His Holiness has said, that there is the fivefold meditation on the lack of the person based on Nagarjuna in chapter 22 of his text, Root Wisdom, the first verse. If the person is not the aggregates are not the person, and then the aggregate person is also not separate from the aggregates. The person is not based on the aggregates, nor the aggregates based on the person, and the person does not possess the aggregates. So that's the fivefold analysis. And then there's the sevenfold that Chandrakirti just adds to that the collection of the aggregates is not the person, nor is the shape of the aggregates. And as I said yesterday, the shape really, it means the configuration. That somebody could say, well, the collection of parts is not the person, because certainly the collection of parts could be disassembled. And then there's definitely no longer a person. So not, I'm sorry to use a little bit of a not a very nice idea, but if we cut a person into pieces, then we'd probably say it's no longer a person, because there's pieces of what once was a person. So then somebody could argue that it's when it's assembled in a particular configuration, that's what makes it a person. And as I said yesterday, the main argument against that Chandrakirti makes is that the configuration of a person is a quality of a person, right? So like the color, something has color and form. It has a particular color, a particular shape, a particular smell, a particular sound, all different qualities of something. Though to say that any one of those qualities is the thing that possesses the quality doesn't make any sense. It begs the question, what is that? So if you say that the person is the shape of the person, well, the shape of what? It comes back to the question of what is the person that possesses that shape. So you're trying to search for a substantial thing that is really behind what appears to the mind. You can't just grasp at one of the qualities of that thing, because those qualities also have to be based on something substantial according to your system. That everything that exists as imputed has to have some kind of substantiality behind it. If we talk about the shape of the person, then there has to be some basis for that shape, something that has the shape. The shape is not the thing itself. And also the problem of the person is more than just a physical entity. The person also has a mind. And we definitely wouldn't say that merely the physical body in a particular configuration is the person, because then the corpse would be the person. But the mind has no shape. So we can't talk about the mind being configured in a particular way. That qualification no longer applies when we talk about mind. So again, this is just a very brief introduction to those points, but that the sevenfold analysis is really one of the best ways to meditate on the selflessness of the persons. So again, if you're interested, that is available in Chandrakirti's work and Tsongkhapa's commentary on that, which has now been translated into English by Thich Jinpa. What is it? Illuminating the intent. Available. And there's also, I think, a book in the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives that you can get. There's the sevenfold analysis of the person, something like that. Chandrakirti's sevenfold analysis. So taking that point and separately from the whole book of Chandrakirti and just explaining that. So now we go on to a new subject. It's still related to the selflessness of the person, but now it's actually arguing with the Samkhya. So we've had many different opponents so far. So Samkhya, some of you might know, is a major school of thought in ancient India, a complex philosophy that has been very influential also for a lot of modern Indian philosophies, especially Vedanta. So it seems like Samkhya gradually evolved into Vedanta or Advaita Vedanta. So I'm not sure if there are Samkhya as a separate school that existing today, but it's still been very influential in a modern Indian Hindu philosophy. So in their system, there is a knower apart from the what's experienced. So very briefly, they are very similar to Buddhists. Among the non-Buddhist systems, it's one of the closest to Buddhism in what they posit, and that they agree that we are cycling in samsara and craving fuels that cycling, and we need to be free of that and liberated. But their understanding is that the problem is that there is a person, and in their system, the mind and the person are the same thing. There is a person who is a mind, who is mere awareness, and is experiencing this cycling in samsara. But the person is completely different from that. The cycling in the samsara, the physical world, as well as the mental world, in terms of anything other than pure awareness, so emotions and so forth, those are all separate from the person. The person is just this pure awareness that exists without any reference to any of those. And it's permanent. It always is aware of these things, but is not aware of itself. Doesn't aware of the way that this samsaric function is being created. But if one can start to see that the awareness is different from what one is aware of, then one no longer is going to be tied up with that. Because to see that these are just objects of awareness. It's like something in a dream. But it has nothing to do with who I am, because I am just merely this awareness. So in their system also, there is what was called prakriti, the final nature. It's like the main nature. I don't know exactly how we translate it in English. In Tibetan, they call it chief soul, which is like the main generality. It meaning that it is the generality. All the things that manifest are coming from that. The manifest world is all a manifestation of this prakriti. And so the way to be liberated is to recognize that. Is to see that it's all just coming from the prakriti. So they have a bit of an odd analogy. They say it's when you recognize the prakriti, it's like you open the bathroom door and there's a naked woman in there and she's embarrassed because she's naked. So she hides because you saw her. So likewise, when you see the prakriti, it gets embarrassed and it hides away and it no longer manifests all of these delusions. So it's just a matter of recognizing that. And then one's left with just pure awareness, liberated from samsara. So in two parts of this chapter, Shantideva is going to argue against them. Later, he argues specifically against Parakriti, but here he's arguing against the idea that there's a permanent knower, this self that's permanent. So if what knows sound is permanent, at all times it would cognize sound. So if awareness is unchanging, then it shouldn't be the case that it's aware of one thing one moment and something else the next moment. So it should, if it's aware of sound one time, it should always be aware of sound. But when what's known is absent, how can you say mind cognizes it? So if you say, okay, well then yeah, mind does cognize all sound all of the time. But how can it be that mind cognizes sound all the time when there's no sound? How can you be cognizing sound when you're not hearing anything? Everything is silent. They're going to attempt to defend this. If mind exists without what's known, it follows trees are conscious too. Actually, this is still Shantideva speaking. They will speak in the next verse. So if mind exists without what's known, it follows trees are conscious too. So you're in your position. Mind exists all the time, even when the object of mind is no longer there. But then trees are conscious too. They don't know anything, but why aren't they conscious? Because in your system, you don't have to know something to be conscious. It's just mere consciousness without an object. And so it's clear that mind does not exist without what's known at hand. So you can't posit that there's some kind of mind that's always permanent without anything that it's aware of. So they respond, that very mind knows form instead. So this is the response to that earlier objection. If mind is permanent, it should know, if it knows sound one time, it should know sound all the time. But they're saying that mind that knows sound, when sound isn't there, it knows form instead of sound. It knows visual objects. The response is, why then does it not also hear? So if it sees, why doesn't it hear? Because the sound is not nearby, they say. So although my mind is at all times perceiving these things, the sound is not nearby. So I walk far to a silent place. I'm no longer hearing sound because there's no sound externally, and thus sound's mind is also gone. So the response is, the mind perceiving sound is also not there when you're not hearing sound. So their idea is that there's a mind that perceives sound, but when there's no sound, it doesn't manifestly perceive it. But still, it's the mind that perceives sound. So like it's saying that I have let's say oral for the ear consciousness, oral consciousness all of the time. But it's only when sound is nearby that I hear anything. So this is in contradiction to the Buddhist view, where there's only oral consciousness or visual consciousness when I'm perceiving something. When there's no longer sound, there's no longer a hearing consciousness. It only arises when sound is nearby. The consciousness arises in relation to objects. What's nature is a knower of sound. How can it also know a form? So you're saying that it takes the place, right? So they were arguing, okay, well that sound, for that mind that knows sound, when there's no sound nearby, then it just knows forms instead. It sees something. So this is like the idea that there's some kind of mind in the head that looks through the eyes or looks through the ears, wherever it wants to go, but it choose to see one thing or the other based on what's nearby. So one person being father and son is designation, not what's real. So in this case, in your argument, then it no longer becomes a real thing. You've argued that that there's a real mind knowing sound. But if it continually switches what it knows, then it has different designations, like a person being both the father and son. One person can be called the father by his son and called the son by his father. But that shows that he's not inherently a father or inherently a son, because it's just a mere designation based on their relation to one other thing. So likewise, it's not inherently a knower of sound. It's only a knower of sound when there's sound that it's hearing. There's no such thing as the real knower of sound independent of sound. Otherwise, somebody could be a father without having a son, but that doesn't make any sense. Somebody's only a father in relation to his son. So sattva, rajas, tamas 2 are not a father nor a son. So this is in the, again, in the Samkhya system, they have these three humors. There's three gunas, they call it three gunas, which constitute the external world, the world that's separate from the mind. And then when those are balanced, that's called the prakriti. And then when they're imbalanced, it's all the manifestations of that. So the samsaric world. So he's saying that the sattva, these three elements, these three gunas, are neither father nor son, meaning that they don't exist inherently in one particular way. They only exist in relation to each other, so they can't be inherently existent. The nature of this isn't seen to have the apprehension of sound. So the nature of this mind is not, does not have the apprehension of sound. It's coming back to the same point that mind cannot be inherently a perceiver of sound without any sound that it's perceiving. It doesn't make any sense to talk about that. So regarding the three gunas, he just mentioned it very briefly here, but this will come back again much later in the text. So he'll talk about them more specifically. What like an actor shifts its role and sees this is impermanent. So a thing that like an actor is continually shifting its role, that it first knows sound and then it knows form. So what like an actor shifts its role and sees this, that thing is impermanent. The grammar is a bit hard here, but that thing that's like an actor that shifts its role and sees different things, that thing is impermanent because it's changing. So you say mind is permanent, but then you say one moment it sees form and one moment it sees sound or hears sound, but that it's constantly changing, so it must be impermanent. If its new role exists in fact, then unity is a novel thing. So you're saying that if you argue that the mind, first it knows sound and then it knows form and it's changing, but each particular role that it plays, either seeing or hearing, is a truly existent thing. And it says then unity is a novel thing. Which, hold on, I'll actually have to look at the commentary here. Yeah, so he's saying that in that context, then if it's a real thing, then it can't be the same as the previous state, right? So there's then in that case, there's two different truly existent minds, because there was the mind that existed truly before that knew sound. Now there's the mind that exists truly now knowing form. But it doesn't. So actually, this is actually a point that has to be pointed out with the Samkhya. In their system, all the manifestations in the world are of one nature. This means because everything comes from the Prakriti. So ultimately, although they all look different, it's really just the Prakriti playing different roles. So really, sound and form are the same thing. They appear differently, but it's just the Prakriti taking on a different aspect. But you're saying that if things are real, if sound is real, then it doesn't make any sense to say it can no longer be one nature with form, because it's real as sound. So he's negating that it could be real. And actually, I don't think they would say that. I think in the Samkhya system, sound and form are both false, because what's real is the Prakriti. But he's just examining one possibility, and they're going to come back and say it's not real, that the sound and form are not real. It's only the Prakriti that's real. So they would say it's like an actor that shifts its role. The actor is real, the role is false. So if the new role isn't true, then tell us what its nature is. So if you say that sound and form, these different roles that the Prakriti takes on, are not real, then what are they? If knowing is a real thing, then all beings would be identical. So he's leaving that point there. What are they? Just he's leaving kind of a rhetorical question. Tell us what they really are if they're not real. But then he's saying if knowing is a real thing, because in this system, the Samkhya, the knower is also true. Then one of the main arguments against this is that all beings would be identical. Because everybody is exactly the same in this being a mere knower. So there's no real difference between one person and the other. And one actually argument that the Buddhist made against the Samkhyas, he doesn't mention it here, is that therefore, if one person is liberated, everyone would be. Because if one person, if all beings are identical in the ultimate analysis, that it's just pure consciousness, and there are definitely people who say this. I've heard people even try to argue about this when they hear Buddhist teachings. They'll say it's often Hindu, people with a Hindu background will say that there's just this one consciousness behind everything, and we're all one being ultimately. But if that's the case, then if somebody in the past achieved liberation, we should also be liberated because we're ultimately the same person. So all beings are exactly the same. So either you have to say that nobody's ever achieved liberation, or we all already have because somebody in the past already did. Because if they achieve liberation, as again according to the system, they recognize the Prakriti for what it is, and then it gets embarrassed and it disappears. So the Prakriti should have disappeared for everybody, and everybody should be free from samsara already. Since both exist, non-knowers and the knowers would become one thing. So also, according to this system, form and sound are of one nature because they are both the same in being Prakriti. So now Shantideva is playing on this term, on this idea that if two things are both of the nature of something else, then they're the same. Then non-knowers and knowers, so the Prakriti, the external world, and the knower, the consciousness, the person, both are the same in existing. So they should become one. But in your system, they're totally separate. But you say all external world is one because it's all the same in being Prakriti, and the underlying thing that is the basis for it. So your philosophy is inconsistent. If you say that, then it should follow that everything that exists, because it all exists, it should all be one because it's all existent. When instances are counterfeit, what base for similarity? So when you're saying that all of the instances, meaning the manifestations in the world, if they're all false, then there's no basis for them to be similar, because to be similar implies that there's this thing that is similar. If everything is false, then there's no similarity because they're not real to begin with. You have to first identify what the things are that are going to be similar. So there's no basis for similarity when you talk about everything being false. Let's look at the commentary here. So the base here is talking about the Prakriti again, right? So this was supposed to be the basis for similarity. But basically he's saying that it can't be real if all of its manifestations are false. It doesn't exist apart from the manifestations. Again, I'm not sure they would agree with that, but this is sort of the Shantideva. So, according to the Buddhist view, that wouldn't work. That if the basis, if all of the things that it manifests as are false, then the basis also is not true, especially in the middle way school. Of course, there is quite some overlap, we might say, between the Samkhya and the mind-only school, because there's it could be argued similarly, and actually a lot of the arguments that are made are the same when they're saying that the alaya vijnana, the foundation consciousness, is the real thing. and everything else is just a manifestation of that. So in the Madhyamaka, that's one of their unique tenets, is that there's nothing that is ultimately real. A lot of the other Indian schools of thought say that the whole manifest world is an illusion, but underlying that is a real thing. Whereas in Madhyamaka, that's not the case. There is no underlying thing that's real. So if everything, all the instances, everything that we experience is counterfeit, then where is there a basis for there being some kind of unreal thing under them? So actually, we're getting close to the time, so we can finish here. And if there's questions, I see there's a question. So. Okay. So back to the question. Here we go. Do you know which commentary is used? Oh, I'm confused. Are you asking me which commentary am I using? Oh, what are you asking? Sorry.
Yeah, I thought that you are sometimes looking into a commentary.
Oh yeah. Okay, yeah.
Commentary.
So okay, yeah, that's right. So as I mentioned, I'm sometimes looking at Gyaltsab Je's commentary. Gyaltsab Dhammarinchen, who was a student of Tsongkhapa. Actually, this commentary is translated into English. It's by Venerable Fedor Strachey, the German monk. So it's actually available for free download, I believe. I think Happy Monk Publications is the website. You can go there, and yeah, he's translated the whole text, and that might be helpful to have that. And as I said, Gyaltsab Je's commentary is based on teachings by Tsongkhapa, and then that in turn is based on many of the Indian commentaries. But this is the one that we generally use in Gelok.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, so the question is, one still has feeling, one will have craving because we think the feelings are inherently existent. When we understand feelings are empty, will we still have feelings conventionally, but not attached to them? Yes and no. So of course, it depends on how much it's emptiness, how much we understand emptiness, right? So at a basic level, when we have a conceptual understanding of emptiness, it will certainly diminish attachment, but of course we'll still have feeling. But feeling there's different kinds of feeling. Feeling in this context is talking about the feeling that is the seventh link of dependent origination, which is a contaminated feeling. It's a feeling that arises through karma. And so we ultimately want to be free of that as well. And so if somebody has a direct perception of emptiness and meditates for a very long time, they no longer will have that either, because they'll no longer be reborn. So they will no longer have the feelings that give rise to craving, which are contaminated feelings. However, they will still have, if someone becomes a Buddha, they will still have uncontaminated bliss, which is no longer going to give rise to craving because it's not conditioned by karma. So it depends, again, if you have, as I say, if you realize emptiness, there's different levels of being free from that. So it's just a matter, it depends on the force of the realization. So Shantideva's idea of real is different from mind only. How can they argue with each other using the same word with a different meaning? That's a good point. Well, for one thing, their idea of real is not so different in as much as what the mind only school considers to be truly existent is, for example, mind. They believe that it exists as it appears. And the middle way school is saying that yes, we agree that real means it exists as it appears, but the mind does not exist as it appears, so it's not real. So in that sense, they do have some similarity there. But even if they didn't have similarity, this is actually part of what Chandakirti, his point about a common locus for argumentation, that it doesn't really matter in the end, because none of us, when we say any word, have the exact same thing appear to our mind. But still, we can argue about them, and I can show you that your own logical use of logic is internally inconsistent. So even if we have a different meaning of the word, I can still argue and make points that cause you to contradict your own position. So it doesn't necessarily matter, although it's good to try to be as consistent as possible. We can still, the middle way school, often when they argue against the mind only, they might use the words in a slightly different way, but it can still point out an inconsistency within their speech or their thinking. How can they be arguing with other using the same word? Well, again, that's coming back to what I'm saying, that this is exactly what Chandrakirti argues with Bhaviveka about, that Bhaviveka is saying, without any inherent existence, without anything findable, then we can't talk about anything because we don't have a common locus for understanding. But Chandrakirti is saying there is no such thing as a common locus for understanding. We don't need one, because all that matters is that my words make sense to you in terms of what your understanding is. It doesn't have to be that we have the exact same thing when we appear into our minds. Ideally, we could, if we have the exact same point of view and the exact same system of tenets, we could have a fairly similar thing appearing, but that doesn't really matter in the end. What matters is that what I say makes sense to you based on your understanding, and it can cause you to change your view. This is, again, the very beginning of the talk with the different levels of convention and ultimate existence. And the Buddha can appear in the world and teach somebody, even though he doesn't experience the world in the same way. He experiences it as a dream. So I gave the example then of somebody having hallucinations. Even though I don't see the hallucinations and I know they're false, I can still talk about them with the person, and I can help them to be at peace with them. So I can say, rather than saying, if the person is afraid of the hallucinated person, of the hallucinated woman he's seeing, I don't have to say, you shouldn't be afraid of the hallucination. I should say, well, you shouldn't be afraid of the woman because she's not going to hurt you, even though there is no woman, but it's just hallucination. So as long as my words are understood by them, and it helps them in their context of understanding to change their mind, and that's good enough. But these arguments have been going on and on, and nobody's mind seems to be changed. Well, that's true, but some people's minds have been changed. Of course, there are still many people who haven't changed their minds, but there ideally have been people who have read these arguments and meditated on them and had realizations. So their minds were changed, even though there might still be others whose minds weren't changed. And in the end, the Buddhist arguments are more important for the Buddhist than for the non-Buddhist. They're less likely to convert a non-Buddhist as to help a Buddhist to understand their own position and not give it up. Now, a lot of the importance of these arguments, and as I said, with the arguments with science today, is that it's very possible a person could lose their faith in Buddhism because they feel that it's contradicted by science. So an argument against science, or not against science per se, but against a materialist perspective, might not convince a materialist, but it might help a Buddhist not to feel that their position is undermined by materialism. So likewise, in this context, it's helping the middle way school not to feel confident in their own position. So in this context, Shantideva's rebuttal of mind only does not feel satisfactory because he is not directly addressing mind only positions, and vice versa. Well, I would say in some parts he is. He's definitely addressing the idea that does mind have to be truly existent because we experience mind, and he's addressing the idea that that there's a truly existent mind without external forms. He's giving some pretty direct arguments, I think, against that. I mean, personally, I'm convinced, I would say, this is part of why we study things this way in the monastery. We studied the mind-only school in quite a bit of depth before we came to really study the Madhyamaka school. And I really liked the mind-only school. I knew we were going, at some level, I knew we were going to negate it eventually, but for the sake of, at the time, we adopt that system. We'd argue that system. And I found it very useful to argue for it. when we finally came and studied Chandrakirti's system, it was much more powerful then, because I could see exactly what he was arguing against, having studied the Mandalay school, and felt, yeah, this really makes sense. I think he's right, and I think that the points he's making are very valid. It doesn't mean that the Mandalay school is just completely wrong. There are many good points they make, but some of the fundamental ideas about a foundational consciousness, I think Chandrakirti pretty decisively shows how it's inconsistent. And actually, to say nobody's mind has changed, it certainly has, because in Tibet, there is nobody who accepts the mind-only school. The ones who are influenced by it have changed it considerably due to the Madhyamaka arguments. There's a book, if you're interested in this, what's it called? The Influence of Yogacara on Mahamudra, I think is the name of the book, by Kyabgyun. I'll have to send you the name. Not coming to mind immediately. There was a Lama, I think a Nyingma Lama, he passed away about 10 years ago. Kyabgyun something Rinpoche. And so yeah, he talks about that, and he said that although in the Nyingma today there is some talk of mind only, and especially foundational consciousness, what they mean is completely different from what the people in the 5th century using that term meant, because it's become much more subtle. Likewise, with the non-Buddhist schools, actually, the Vaiseshika, which we'll come to later in this text, they changed their system based on the Buddhist arguments. They modified it because they recognized inconsistencies based on things Dharmakirti said, which actually became a detriment for the Buddhist today. My teacher was telling me about this. You might, I don't know if any of you have heard of this, in Varanasi about some years ago, there was a debate staged between Buddhists and Hindus. It might have been Vaisheshika. Yeah, I think it actually was Vaisheshikas, because their school is still existing. And so the Buddhists, when they prepared for this debate, they mainly prepared based on reading Dharmakirti's arguments, which are against the Vaisheshika school as it was existing in the 6th and 7th centuries. And they weren't prepared for the fact that the Vaisheshikas had actually already internalized Dharmakirti's arguments and changed their view as a result. So they were unprepared, and they lost the debate because they weren't aware that what they were arguing against, the Vaisheshika could very easily negate, because they'd already heard the argument and come up with a very good response that changed their system to accommodate it. So that shows that the Buddhists have been a little bit left behind. So they're constantly changing. So both Buddhism and Hinduism have refined their views considerably, even if they haven't converted to one or the other. They've had to change their views. So that was what happened. Shankara was generally considered the father of modern Hindu philosophy, and that was in the 8th century, probably. And he understood Buddhism very well. He read Nagarjuna's texts very closely, and the mind-only school also. It's often said that what he managed to do was to repackage their philosophy as Hinduism. And therefore, it was effective in defeating Buddhism in India, because he used their ideas and then called it Hinduism. And so, although ultimately the Hindus won in the sense that Buddhism died out in India, a lot of modern Hindu philosophy is very heavily based on a lot of the Buddhist arguments that were being made. So that's not, it's certainly the views are changing all of the time, and hopefully they'll continue refining them. And again, as I said before, I think especially now it has to do with science. That's what I feel, that both sides in some sense have to change. Buddhism is challenged by science in a lot of ways. It doesn't just negate Buddhism entirely, but it's going to force Buddhists to refine their views significantly in light of a lot of new evidence and a lot of new ways of thinking. So from earlier question about feelings, as body form is also contaminated after realizing emptiness directly, how will we see the body as it is still there conventionally? Okay. Well, two things. After realizing emptiness directly, there's three ways one can realize emptiness directly: using the Hinayana path, using the Mahayana path, or using Tantric path. So if using the Hinayana path, yes, if one realizes emptiness directly, then no longer does one, one still has the contaminated body. But actually, according to the Mahayana sutras, even the non-tantric ones, if one realizes emptiness directly as a bodhisattva, the force of the merit that's been accumulated will actually stop the body from being contaminated, and one no longer has a contaminated body after that. One no longer is reborn in samsara, even from the path of seeing. At least not reborn under the power of karma and afflictions. And then in the tantric path, it's even different, that one actually achieves the illusory body, which is no longer related even to the contaminated body in any way. But the other question is how we still see the body as it still is there conventionally. Well, even so, we'd say a Hinayana practitioner, they realize emptiness and they still have the contaminated body. Having realized emptiness directly does not prevent one from seeing conventionality. There's no problem with that at all. Within the direct perception of emptiness, there is no experience of conventions. And that's why in Chandakirti's system, I don't know, I don't want to confuse you too much, but you might have heard of remainderless nirvana, which according to most Buddhist schools of philosophy is referring to when an arhat dies and the body disappears because they died and they're no longer connected to the body. But according to Chandakirti's system, remainderless nirvana means direct perception of emptiness. When an arhat, a Hinayana practitioner who's not an arhat but who has direct perception of emptiness is in that direct equipoise, then that's called the remainderless nirvana, because there's no more experience of conventional of the contaminated body. This has to do with Chandakirti's interpretation of Nagarjuna and his understanding that there's no nirvana is not somewhere you go. It has to do simply with the way the mind experiences reality. So to talk about remainderless nirvana is something that is achieved when somebody dies. That actually is denigrating nirvana, because it implies that it's something that wasn't there to begin with, whereas nirvana is a natural state that just has to be realized. This is talked about a lot in the 60 stanzas by Nagarjuna, and then Chandakirti's commentary on that. But I won't get into it too much here, it'll be too complicated, but I'll just give you a brief idea of that. So I said what I said because I am only now realizing there is a whole different teaching on meditation based on mind's ability to know itself. Yeah, that's a big question. As I said, all of the, not just the Buddhist schools, all of the Indian schools are questioning that. Can the mind know itself? What does that even mean? So yeah, that's something to think about a lot. And it's not that just because one teacher says this, Chandakirti says that mind doesn't know itself, it doesn't mean it's not a matter of accepting it. It's a matter of examining it and seeing whether what he said is true based on our experience and based on looking at his reasoning. So, okay. So yeah, it's already 8:10, which is fine. But we can continue tomorrow. So I think we finished 67 verses. It's better than I expected, actually. So I think we probably can finish tomorrow, because a lot of the first talk today was introductory. And so if we go through the verses one by one, but let's see, it's no need to rush. So I don't want, if we don't finish, it's okay, but let's just see tomorrow. And yeah, thank you all. Good night or good morning. I'll see you tomorrow. I think maybe some of you, maybe it'll be later today, I'm not sure. Yeah, have a good night. Anything else?
Thank you so much, Venerable Gache. Good night to Sarah.
Okay. Thank you all. Yeah, it's honestly, it's sometimes a bit, thank you. It's a bit disconcerting talking into Zoom because you don't hear anything back. So I say good night and I wonder if that's what's going on. But okay, I think you all understood. So Thank you. And yeah, I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Oh,
so
actually,
much.
one other thing.
Tomorrow.
I mentioned, you asked about the verses, so I made it into a PDF file. So I'll send that now to Venerable Kunpen, and hopefully she can send it out. Let me know if there's any problem with it, because this computer does not have Acrobat readers. That might be a problem. So if you can't access it, let me know, and I'll change it tomorrow on a different computer, but I'll send it right now.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. And I will put it in the resource folder on our webpage. When you go on our website, we created already a resource folder, so I will put it in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tashida.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
everyone.
A good
Good
day
night.
wherever you are. Bye-bye.